I sit at a wooden table in a townhouse where the walls do not listen, 13 months after the day my marriage ended. The air here smells like pine cleaner and fresh coffee, far away from the house that almost cost me my son, my career, and my freedom. It took over a year to build this quiet life. The collapse of my old one started much faster, inside a windowless briefing room at the Maryland Army National Guard headquarters. The legal transcript felt heavy and cold as the advisor slid it across the metal table. The air conditioning hummed above us, a low, relentless drone that matched the sudden ringing in my ears. I kept my hands folded in my lap, forcing myself to maintain the posture of an officer. I was 39 years old, a lieutenant colonel handling emergency continuity operations for the state. My entire professional life revolved around planning for disasters, yet I was currently being asked to explain why my own family needed to be protected from me. "Do you deny that your son is afraid of you?" the legal advisor asked. I stared at the black ink on the page. They only gave me a short excerpt to read, a few disjointed sentences stripped of all surrounding context. Colonel Denise Harper sat beside him, her posture rigid, her face completely unreadable. She informed me that my upcoming promotion review was officially paused, and while I had the right to respond to the allegations in writing, the military could not ignore recorded evidence of domestic instability. I did not argue with her. I did not plead my case. I just read the timestamp printed at the top of the paper. It was from a Tuesday night, the exact evening my husband Ryan had deliberately woken our 8-year-old up past midnight just to start an argument with me. 3 days earlier, after 6 months of absolute silence, my son called me. I had been standing in front of the continuity plan board at the base, checking deployment schedules for the upcoming quarter. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. My personal phone vibrated in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, the caller ID showed a prepaid number I had memorized but never expected to see active. Stepping into a quiet, empty corridor, I answered the call. All I heard at first was the ragged rhythm of shallow breathing and a faint, metallic click. "Noah?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Mom, come home before Dad does," a trembling voice whispered. "There is something behind the basement wall." He had not spoken a single word to his teachers, his doctors, or to me for half a year. Hearing his voice felt like catching a falling glass just a second before it shattered. The urge to bombard him with questions was overwhelming, but I forced my tone to stay perfectly even. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No," he said, the sound barely carrying over the cellular connection. "Where is Dad right now?" "He went to pick up dinner. He will be back soon." "Lock the door," I told him. "I am on my way." Walking back into the main office, I told my supervisor I had a severe family emergency, grabbed my car keys, and left without offering any further explanations. The drive from Columbia to our suburban neighborhood usually took 20 minutes on a good day. I made the trip in 15, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth. I counted my breaths, inhaling for 4 seconds, holding for 2, exhaling for 4, treating the situation exactly like the crisis management drills I ran at work. I dialed my neighbor Nia Brooks, asking her to stand on her porch and keep an eye on my driveway. I told her not to go inside the house, just to watch the street. Then I sent a quick text message to Andrea Lawson, the family attorney I had consulted several months ago when I first started quietly preparing a way out. My son called. "I may need emergency help." I did not call Ryan. I knew exactly what phone Noah had used to reach me. It was a cheap, simple mobile device I had hidden at the bottom of his emergency backpack, wrapped in a spare pair of socks. Ryan kept moving the backpack around the house, claiming it was always in the way, but Noah must have finally found it. The fact that my son felt he needed a hidden phone to speak to his own mother told me everything I needed to know about the danger we were in. Parking my car on the street rather than pulling into the driveway, I left the engine running and ran to the front porch. Noah opened the door before I even had a chance to turn the knob. He looked terribly pale, standing perfectly still in the shadowed foyer. He did not say another word. He just grabbed my hand, his small fingers icy cold, and pulled me toward the basement stairs. The air down there smelled like damp concrete, old cardboard, and the metallic tang of heated electronics. Noah led me past the stacked storage boxes to a heavy oak bookshelf built into the far wall. He pushed his small shoulder against the wood, and the entire structure slid sideways on a hidden track. Behind the shelf sat a large magnetic wall panel, painted to match the drywall. Noah pointed to the bottom edge, where a thin sliver of warm air escaped, carrying the faint, high-pitched whine of a cooling fan. Reaching into his pocket, he handed me a small flathead screwdriver. The metal tip was scratched, proving he had already tried to pry the panel open himself. I wedged the tool into the narrow seam, applying gentle pressure until the heavy magnetic catches popped loose. Pulling the panel back carefully, I made absolutely sure not to bend the metal frame or scratch the surrounding paint. Pale blue light spilled into the dim basement. It was not just a security camera. It was a fully functioning surveillance room. A tall metal rack held multiple hard drives, network switches, and processing units. A cooling fan hummed steadily inside the cavity, pushing hot air directly into my face. Pinned to the exposed drywall beside the equipment was a printed floor plan of our house, marked with small red dots indicating hidden microphones in the kitchen, the main hallway, the master bedroom, and the playroom. 3 monitors glowed on a small wooden desk wedged into the tight space. The center screen displayed an open digital folder boldly titled Angry Mom. Another monitor played a muted video clip of me standing by the kitchen island, filmed from a high, downward angle right near the smoke detector. Noah pointed to a large black headset resting on the edge of the desk and immediately covered his ears with both hands. The anger hit me then, a cold and precise fury. I wanted to rip the wires from the walls, and I wanted to smash the monitors onto the concrete floor. But my military training overrode the instinct, reminding me that destroying the room would only prove the violent narrative Ryan was trying to build. I did not touch the keyboard, nor did I unplug a single wire. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording a continuous, unbroken video. I captured the hallway outside, the sliding bookshelf, the opened magnetic panel, and the glowing screens. Zooming in, I documented the serial numbers of the main rack and the small, portable, solid-state drive plugged into the front bay. I read the date, the time, and the physical location aloud, keeping my voice steady for the recording. Bright headlights suddenly swept across the small basement window, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. Noah flinched, his entire body trembling as he backed away from the blue light. I snapped the magnetic panel back into place, pressing the edges until they sat perfectly flush against the drywall. Sliding the heavy oak bookshelf back to its original position, I hid the seam completely. I grabbed Noah by the hand and hurried up the wooden stairs, breathing hard by the time we reached the main floor. Opening the front door wide, I stepped out onto the porch where Nia's security camera across the street could clearly see us leaving. Ryan's car idled in the driveway. He stepped out, holding a white paper bag that smelled strongly of fried food. "Why is the basement light on?" Ryan asked, his brow furrowing as he looked from me to our shaking child. "The furnace started beeping," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. It sent Noah into a panic. "I went down to check the breaker, but I am going to take him out for the night so he can calm down." Ryan looked toward the open door of the house, then back at us. The sight of our son shaking and clinging to my coat seemed to satisfy him, convincing him that Noah was just having an anxiety episode. He did not realize what we had actually found behind the wall. I buckled Noah into the back seat of my car and backed out of the driveway. As soon as we turned the corner, I dialed my lawyer. "He does not know what I saw," I told Andrea, watching the dark suburban houses roll past the passenger window. "We need the court before he does." The tires hissed against the wet asphalt as my car left our subdivision, putting physical distance between my son and the hidden room. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles throbbed, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Noah sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. He did not ask where we were going, and his silence felt heavier than any scream. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to Andrea Lawson take quick notes on the other end of the line. The family attorney possessed a sharp, unsentimental legal mind, and she immediately understood the gravity of the video currently saved on my device. "Did you break the magnetic seal permanently?" Andrea asked, her voice crackling slightly over the car speaker. "No," I replied, merging onto the highway. I pushed the panel back exactly as I found it. Ryan thinks the furnace scared Noah, and I told him we were just getting out of the house for the night to cool down. "Good. Do not go back there alone, and absolutely do not text your husband any details about what you found." A brief pause followed. "You had a private credit card ready for a hotel, and you knew exactly who to call. How long have you been planning to leave?" "Long enough to know planning is not the same as being ready." Andrea instructed me to forward the incident journal I had been keeping for 4 months, along with the follow-up emails and copies of our joint financial statements. I had quietly saved all of those documents to a secure, separate email address weeks before this nightmare erupted. She promised to file an ex parte motion the very next morning, asking the judge for temporary protective conditions and a strict preservation order. We needed a court mandate preventing the deletion, movement, or remote access of any surveillance equipment before Ryan even realized his secret was out. We spent that first night at a quiet chain hotel 2 towns over. The fluorescent lights in the lobby buzzed, casting long shadows across the patterned carpet. Once inside the room, Noah immediately walked to the center of the space and tilted his head backward, scanning the corners of the ceiling. He pulled a small notepad from his emergency backpack and wrote 2 words. "No cameras?" My throat tightened. Walking over to the small desk, I unbuckled my smartwatch, powered off my personal phone, and closed my laptop. I placed all 3 devices in the hallway outside our door. Returning to the bed, I told him he did not have to explain anything to me tonight. My son curled up on top of the covers, pulling my heavy military fleece jacket over his shoulders, and finally closed his eyes. The legal machinery moved faster than I expected, driven by Andrea and the undeniable proof of the video. By noon the following day, a judge signed the ex parte preservation order. Ryan was officially served at the house before he had any reason to suspect I knew about the basement wall. The mandate explicitly forbade him from altering the main rack, and a neutral technician arrived shortly after to photograph the equipment and apply tamper-evident seals. Ryan tried to call me 5 times. I let every single attempt go to voicemail, following legal advice to keep all communications strictly in writing. When the phone rang a 6th time, the screen displayed a different name. Judith. My mother-in-law rarely called unless she wanted an audience for a grievance, I answered, bracing myself for the practiced concern she always weaponized against me. "You took that boy from his father," Judith said, her voice dripping with sharp disappointment. "Ryan is pacing the floors, Morgan. He has no idea why you are acting this erratic." "Ryan can speak to my attorney," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "A child needs stability," Judith continued, ignoring my boundary completely. "Not a mother who constantly chooses a uniform over her own family. You have always put your ambition first, and now you are punishing Ryan for being the parent who actually stayed home." The specific phrasing caught my attention. It sounded rehearsed, almost like she was reading from a script. I told her I would not discuss custody over the phone, and ended the call. 2 minutes later, my screen lit up with a massive block of text from her, repeating the exact same accusations about my military career endangering her grandson. I did not reply, but I took a screenshot and saved it to the secure folder. 72 hours after the escape, the the consequences of Ryan losing control over us finally materialized at my workplace. The swift retaliation brought me straight into the windowless briefing room at the Maryland Army National Guard headquarters, sitting across from Colonel Denise Harper and a civilian legal advisor. The transcript of the altered audio file lay on the metal table between us, isolating my raised voice while completely erasing the context of Ryan waking our son up at midnight. "The command takes these allegations seriously," Colonel Harper said, her posture rigid. "Your promotion review is temporarily paused pending a full administrative inquiry. We can offer you a period of leave, or you can transition to non-sensitive duties while this is sorted out." The military protocol required them to investigate, and I understood the system well enough to know Colonel Harper could not simply wave away a domestic complaint. Ryan had counted on this exact reaction. He wanted me desperate, terrified of losing my rank, and willing to beg for his help to clear my name. The legal advisor leaned forward, tapping a pen against the table. "If you can bring your son in for a brief evaluation with our family advocacy team, we could potentially expedite the dismissal of these claims." My hands rested on my knees under the table, fingers curled into tight fists. The idea of dragging my terrified, silent 8-year-old into a military facility to be questioned by strangers made my stomach turn. Ryan had already weaponized the boy to build this trap, and I refused to use him as a shield to dismantle it. "No," I told them, looking directly into the colonel's eyes. "Give me the allegations, the dates, and the formal process. I will answer them thoroughly in writing, but my son will not be used as my defense." Colonel Harper held my gaze for a long moment, a flicker of respect passing behind her stoic expression, before she nodded and closed the file. I accepted the career delay, knowing that fighting on Ryan's terms would only validate his twisted narrative. Leaving the base, I drove to a quiet residential street in Columbia. A month before the basement discovery, I had signed a lease on a small 2-bedroom townhouse using my own salary and emergency savings. It was a modest space, lacking the expansive yard and high ceilings of the marital home, but the walls belonged entirely to me. Noah stood in the empty living room, clutching his backpack. I handed him the spare key, and a small, tentative smile broke across his face. He walked up the narrow carpeted stairs and chose the bedroom facing the backyard. Opening his bag, he pulled out a blue plastic folder filled with his drawings and placed it carefully on the center of the built-in desk. The rest of the afternoon went towards setting up the utilities using a private email address, wiping down the dusty kitchen counters, and installing a heavy steel deadbolt on the front door. Every turn of the screwdriver felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of autonomy. For the first time in over a decade, I did not have to ask for permission to secure my own home. Late in the evening, the phone buzzed on the kitchen island. A text message from Ryan appeared on the locked screen. "Come home before you make this irreversible." The sheer arrogance of the demand radiated from the glowing text. He still believed he held all the leverage, trusting that the military investigation and the threat to my career would force my compliance. Before I could decide whether to forward the message to my legal team, Andrea called. Her usual crisp, professional greeting was missing, replaced by a tight urgency. "Ryan just filed an emergency petition in family court," Andrea said, the sound of rapid typing echoing in the background of the call. "He is not claiming kidnapping, because you have joint legal rights and stayed within the state. But he is accusing you of withholding access, child endangerment, and parental alienation." I leaned against the cool granite counter, listening to the legal machinery locking into place. "He is demanding an immediate order returning Noah to the marital residence," Andrea continued, reading straight from the filing. "And he is asking the judge to grant him temporary primary custody until you undergo a psychological evaluation." My husband had struck first, twisting my frantic effort to save our child into the actions of an unstable, vindictive woman. The man had presented his altered audio clips, deployed his mother as a character witness, and forced the military to sideline my career. In the eyes of the court and the command, he had already painted his masterpiece. Now I had to prove the entire canvas was a lie. Returning to the marital home felt like walking onto a battlefield under a flag of truce. The morning air hung thick with Maryland humidity, and sweat prickled the back of my neck as Andrea Lawson and I walked up the concrete driveway. A neutral forensic technician followed close behind us, carrying 2 heavy aluminum transit cases. Ryan stood on the front porch with his own attorney, his arms crossed casually over his chest. My husband wore a perfectly pressed polo shirt and a look of complete, unbothered patience. He was playing the part of the reasonable father, the man forced to humor an erratic wife who had fled into the night for no logical reason. "You know you did not have to bring a court order for the security system," Ryan said, directing his words to Andrea rather than me. "Morgan has always known about the cameras. It is just for the safety of the house." Engaging with his lies would only give him the reaction he desperately wanted to record. I simply led the group down the stairs, where the basement air smelled intensely of damp cardboard and metallic dust. The court officer had done his job well the previous day. Bright red tamper evident tape stretched across the heavy oak bookshelf and the surrounding wall, proving nobody had moved the structure since the ex parte order was served. The forensic technician carefully sliced the thick plastic seals, and I applied gentle pressure to the bookshelf until it slid along its hidden track. Pulling the magnetic panel away from the drywall revealed the glowing rack of equipment. The technician immediately began documenting the physical layout with a digital camera, but my eyes locked onto a glaring empty space. The small bay on the front of the server was completely bare. The portable solid-state drive I had recorded on my phone just 72 hours ago was gone. Andrea stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor. The attorney asked Ryan directly where the storage device had been moved. A thin, practiced smile touched the corners of his mouth. He claimed it was merely a cold backup, a drive he disconnected every single night as a basic data protection protocol. He pointed to a printed equipment checklist, taped to the edge of the hidden desk. The paper actually supported his story, explicitly listing a nightly disconnection routine. He insisted he had removed the drive hours before the court order was served, making his actions perfectly legal and routine. "Where is the drive now?" the technician asked, pulling an imaging cable from a metal case. "In my home office," Ryan replied, gesturing toward the wooden stairs. "I will go get it." We waited in the cold basement for nearly 15 minutes. When my husband finally returned, his hands were empty. A faint sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. He claimed he must have misplaced the drive during the chaos of my sudden departure, suggesting it might have fallen behind a desk or ended up in a moving box. Andrea did not argue. She simply pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote down his exact explanation, letting the heavy silence do the interrogating. Arrogant men always believed they could talk their way out of a missing piece of evidence, completely forgetting that courts despised a convenient coincidence. Ryan had just cemented his claim to a nightly routine, meaning he would eventually have to explain why a daily backup drive had permanently vanished. The technician powered up the main display to capture the router logs and cache tokens before shutting the entire system down for transport. An image of our house floor plan filled the center monitor. Small red dots clustered around the kitchen island, the main hallway, the master bedroom, and the exact corner of the playroom where Noah sat for his online therapy sessions. My chest tightened as a specific memory surfaced. 3 weeks ago, I had been standing directly under the kitchen smoke detector. A tiny red light had reflected off the polished granite counter, while Ryan systematically backed me into a verbal corner over a forgotten grocery list. He had kept his own voice eerily calm, refusing to raise his tone, simply waiting for my exhaustion to snap into anger. Looking at the map, the terrifying reality finally settled in. He had choreographed every single argument we ever had, placing the stages perfectly underneath his hidden microphones. Next to the keyboard sat a physical manila folder. The technician flipped it open with gloved hands, revealing a printed calendar that documented every single day I had been away from home over the past 2 years. Most of the marked dates were public knowledge, easily pulled from unit newsletters or holiday schedules. However, 2 specific weekend deployments highlighted in yellow had never been published anywhere. Only the command staff and a few administrative specialists knew those dates in advance. Nia Brooks, the neighbor who had helped me secure the perimeter of my house the night I fled, handled the scheduling for my division. A sick, heavy feeling settled in my stomach. The idea that someone inside my own unit might be feeding Ryan information felt like a second, deeper betrayal. I hated myself for immediately suspecting the woman who had stood on her porch to watch my back, but the calendar proved Ryan possessed access to military timelines he had no business seeing. I needed the solid reality of the townhouse. Leaving the legal team to finish the imaging and packing process, I drove back to my new home. Noah sat on the living room floor surrounded by unpacked cardboard boxes, building a small tower out of wooden blocks. We needed to establish the boundaries of our new life. Sitting down across from him on the carpet, I laid out 3 unbreakable rules. First, absolutely no cameras in the house. Second, nobody was ever allowed to speak for him. Third, all bedroom doors required a loud knock before entering. My son still did not use his voice. Instead, he pulled out a pad of yellow sticky notes, drew a small, precise check mark on the top sheet, and pressed it firmly against the painted wall. While he carried his folded clothes upstairs, I grabbed my own toolbox from the trunk of the car. I spent the next hour installing a heavy steel deadbolt on the front door, drilling the reinforced strike plate directly into the wooden frame. The mechanical turn of the lock sliding into place sounded like a promise. I was not waiting for anyone to secure the perimeter for me anymore. Sweeping up the wood shavings, I ordered dinner and spent the evening repairing a wobbly wooden desk for Noah's room, refusing to buy expensive new furniture when I could fix the broken things myself. The fragile peace lasted exactly until the next morning. My phone vibrated against the kitchen island. Andrea's name flashed across the screen, and I picked it up immediately. The lawyer did not bother with a polite greeting. The technician managed to pull a temporary cache file from the basement router before they shut the system down, Andrea said, her voice dropping an octave. It is an audio fragment. You need to hear this. A small click echoed over the speaker, followed by a burst of static. Then, I heard my own voice, distorted and loud, shouting that I could not keep living like a ghost in my own house. The recording paused my outburst with a sharp editing cut. A faint rustling sound followed, cloth rubbing against a microphone. Then came Ryan, speaking in a chillingly calm whisper. Wait. Let her finish. This is the part I need. The audio hissed for another second before a third voice murmured something indistinct in the background. It was definitely not Noah. The cadence was older, slightly raspy, and belonged entirely to my mother-in-law. I set the phone down on the wooden table, staring out the window at the quiet suburban street. Judith had been in the room, or at least on an open speakerphone line, actively listening as her son orchestrated my destruction. The woman who had accused me of tearing a family apart had actually helped build the trap that destroyed it. A silver sedan idled in front of my townhouse when I stepped out to check the mail. The heavy scent of expensive floral perfume cut through the humid morning air long before Judith even rolled down her window. My mother-in-law killed the engine, stepping onto the cracked sidewalk with a practiced expression of deep maternal sorrow. She wore a perfectly pressed beige cardigan, looking every bit the concerned grandmother, but the tight line of her mouth betrayed a completely different agenda. You cannot keep him away from his own family, Judith said, stopping a few feet from my front door. Ryan is a wreck. I want to see Noah. I kept my distance, resting my hand on the metal handle of the screen door. We had no formal safety agreement in place yet, and I refused to let anyone from that house interrogate my son. I told her Noah was not receiving visitors today. I heard you screaming at my son, Judith snapped, dropping the concerned act entirely and crossing her arms over her chest. Noah was absolutely cringing in the background. A good mother would step down from her military promotion and get the help she needs, instead of destroying a home. My grip on the door handle tightened. Did you actually see Noah cringing in the room with your own eyes? She deflected, adjusting the strap of her leather purse. I know what I heard over the phone. Ryan called me because he was terrified. A good grandmother would ask why her grandson was afraid to speak a single word in his own house, I replied. I stepped backward into the foyer and closed the heavy door, waiting until the deadbolt clicked firmly into place. Her mention of a phone call perfectly aligned with the audio cache Andrea had recovered the previous afternoon. Sitting at my newly repaired wooden desk, I reviewed the transcript the forensic expert had provided. The full context of the recording finally made sense of the extra voice. Judith had not been standing in the physical room during that argument. Ryan had placed his phone on the kitchen counter, dialed his mother on speakerphone, and deliberately provoked me while she listened quietly on the other end. Instead of asking her son why he was secretly broadcasting a private marital dispute, Judith had muttered a simple word of encouragement. She told him to keep documenting. My mother-in-law had not built the surveillance room, nor did she know about the complex network of hidden microphones in the ceiling. But she absolutely knew Ryan was harvesting audio, and she chose to enable his behavior because the resulting narrative confirmed everything she already wanted to believe about my career. The revelation about the audio forced me to confront the other piece of evidence that had been keeping me awake. The printed family calendar found in the basement still bothered me, specifically the 2 secure military dates that pointed toward a leak in my unit. Opening my laptop, I logged into our shared cloud account and pulled up the version history of the digital schedule. The forensic trail took less than 10 minutes to unravel. Ryan had simply copied public unit events and manually added his own notes. The 2 supposedly confidential dates had not come from a military mole at all. Scrolling back through my personal inbox, I found an old thread where I had emailed those exact dates to my husband months ago, asking him to coordinate school pickups because I would be out of town. He had weaponized my own logistical planning against me. A massive weight lifted from my chest. Nia Brooks, the administrative specialist who had helped secure my perimeter on the night we fled, was completely innocent. I called her immediately, explaining that I had quietly verified a scheduling discrepancy and apologizing for letting my paranoia get the best of me. "You do not owe me an apology for checking the facts," Nia said, her voice warm and steady over the line. "You protect your perimeter first. That is what a good officer does." Protecting the perimeter meant gathering independent witnesses who had interacted with Noah outside of Ryan's direct control. The next morning, the elementary school hallways smelled strongly of floor wax and stale crayons as I sat down across from Mrs. Gable in the quiet counselor office. The veteran teacher listened carefully as I asked for a written record of my son's classroom behavior over the last 6 months. "Your husband attended every single meeting," the teacher explained, folding her hands on the table. "But I did notice something strange. Whenever Ryan had to step out into the hallway to take a phone call, Noah would immediately write much longer sentences on his whiteboard. His entire posture would relax." She opened a manila folder and slid a piece of construction paper across the table. It was a drawing Noah had done during art class 3 months ago. My stomach dropped. The image depicted a series of red dots clustered on a white ceiling and a large face below with the mouth heavily crossed out in black crayon. Mrs. Gable said she had expressed concern at the time, but Ryan had smoothly explained that Noah was just overly obsessed with security cameras from a new video game. I asked the teacher to formalize those exact observations in an email to my lawyer, securing a crucial piece of independent evidence that existed long before the divorce filings. We took that same careful approach to his psychological care. Dr. Maya Bennett operated out of a quiet, sunlit office that deliberately avoided harsh overhead lighting. She was an independent child therapist who understood that forcing a traumatized boy to speak would only cause further damage. During our first session, she offered Noah 3 simple choices for communication. He could write on a pad, draw on a board, or point to a set of illustrated cards. I sat in a chair on the far side of the room, keeping a respectful distance and resisting every maternal urge to hover over his shoulder. Noah selected a thick black marker and a piece of blank paper. He did not draw a picture this time. Instead, he carefully wrote 2 words in large, uneven letters. Walls. Here. Maya simply nodded, making a quiet note on her clipboard. She assured him that her office had absolutely no recording devices of any kind, and I watched the rigid tension slowly drain from his small shoulders. The therapist instructed me later to never ask leading questions, emphasizing that his recovery needed to happen on his terms, completely free from the pressure of building a legal case. While we worked to create a safe environment, Ryan and his mother finalized their paper assault. Andrea forwarded me a sworn affidavit filed with the family court that afternoon, signed directly by Judith. The document contained sweeping claims that Noah was terrified of me, that I always prioritized the military over my family, and that I had repeatedly threatened to abandon them. Reading through the pages, Andrea quickly highlighted a fatal flaw. Every single statement was based entirely on pure inference and secondhand stories fed to her by Ryan. But one specific sentence stood out, freezing the blood in my veins. Judith had used an incredibly unique phrasing to describe my parenting, and those exact words matched a line from the anonymous complaint sent to my military commanders weeks earlier. That evening, as I sat on the couch turning that realization over in my mind, my phone vibrated against the coffee table. A new text message from Ryan illuminated the screen. It was an image file sent without any warning. I tapped the photo, and a picture of Noah's old bedroom filled the display. The space had been immaculately cleaned, the toys perfectly arranged, and a fresh blanket smoothed over the mattress. "He belongs here," the caption read. Ryan wanted to intimidate me, to prove that he maintained complete control over the marital home. But arrogance always makes people careless. My eyes scanned the background of the image, moving past the neatly made bed and the organized bookshelf, settling on the edge of the wooden desk in the corner of the room. Sitting right next to a stack of children's books was a small, rectangular piece of black plastic. I zoomed in on the image until the pixels blurred slightly, but the white numbers printed on the casing remained perfectly legible. It was the missing portable solid-state drive, bearing the exact same serial number I had recorded on my phone the night we discovered the hidden wall. Ryan had claimed the drive was lost in his home office, but he had actually hidden the cold backup in the one place he assumed a neutral technician would never be allowed to search. The heavy door of the forensic firm clicked shut, sealing Andrea Lawson and me inside a soundproof review room. The technician sat before a pair of glowing monitors, pulling up the automatic cloud backup file his team had successfully reconstructed that morning. The audio clip Ryan had submitted to my command lasted exactly 40 seconds. It painted a devastating, condensed picture of an unhinged mother screaming at her patient husband. The recovered original file ran for over 6 minutes. Andrea handed me a pair of studio headphones. I slipped them over my ears, pressing the padded cups tight. The technician pressed a key, and the quiet hiss of background static filled the room. The recording began near midnight. A heavy door clicked open. Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floor, moving directly into the playroom where Noah sometimes fell asleep on the small couch. Ryan spoke first, his voice artificially loud in the quiet house, telling our 8-year-old son to wake up because his mother was never home to put him to bed. A small, confused whimper echoed through the speakers. My own voice entered the track a moment later, frantic and hushed, begging Ryan to step out into the hallway and let the boy sleep. My husband refused. He physically blocked the doorway, his breathing heavy and close to the hidden microphone. He kept repeating the same calculated phrases, asking why I prioritized my uniform over our family, prodding the exact bruises he had spent years mapping out. He wanted a reaction, and he kept pushing until my exhaustion finally shattered. "I cannot do this anymore," my shout tore through the audio track. In the 40-second version, that sentence sounded like a threat to abandon my family. In the full 6-minute context, it was the desperate plea of a mother begging her husband to stop using their child as a weapon. Heavy footsteps faded as I left the room to de-escalate the situation. The recording hissed in the empty space for another 10 seconds. Then, Ryan whispered into the quiet room, "That one was better." The clip did not end where my husband told everyone it ended. I sat perfectly still, staring at the gray sound waves dancing across the monitor. The audio hissed with dead air, capturing the heavy silence of a house at midnight. Then, the terrible sound of Noah crying softly filled my ears. It was a jagged, terrified noise. "When they ask who scares you, who do you point to?" Ryan asked. The gentle, patient tone he used in public was completely gone, replaced by a flat, metallic coldness. Noah did not answer. He just kept making those small, jagged sounds. "If you tell them about the microphones, they will take away Mom's uniform." The threat hung in the air, sharp and precise. "Do you want Mom to go to jail?" A tiny hiccup broke from my son. I pulled the headphones off, dropping them onto the table with a loud clatter. My chair scraped violently against the floor as I stood up, the edges of my vision blurred, and my hands curled into tight fists against the edge of the desk. Every instinct demanded that I drive back to that house, kick the front door off its hinges, and force the man to look me in the eye. Andrea remained completely still. The attorney let me breathe, watching the fury radiate off me before speaking. "This file guarantees you full custody," Andrea said, keeping her voice low and even. "It proves severe coercive control and emotional abuse. But we have to make a strategic choice about the Military Review Board." A military legal advisor joined our meeting through a secure conference call. He suggested a proactive strike. If we released the full 6-minute audio directly to Colonel Harper and the command staff, it would instantly dismantle the anonymous complaint and clear my name. My promotion review would be reinstated by the end of the week. I looked at the black headphones sitting on the desk. Releasing the file meant putting the sound of my child weeping, the sound of his father breaking his spirit, into the hands of a dozen military officers. It would become office gossip, a tragedy discussed over coffee in the break room. Ryan had spent half a year treating Noah like an asset, and releasing this file to save my own career felt dangerously close to doing the exact same thing. "No," I told the speakerphone. The military advisor paused. "Colonel, if you withhold this context from the board, the administrative delay will become permanent. You will lose the promotion. I will lose a title before I let him lose what is left of his privacy," I replied. "You can inform Colonel Harper that I accept the delay. The audio stays sealed for family court." Returning to the townhouse that evening felt like crossing a border into a sanctuary. The streetlights flickered to life as I parked the car. Inside, the smell of roasted chicken filled the small kitchen. Noah sat on the rug in the living room, surrounded by his colored pencils. He did not look up when I walked in, but he reached beside him and picked up the blue plastic folder he had brought from the old house. He stood up, walked over to the kitchen island, and slid the folder across the smooth granite. I opened the plastic cover. Inside lay a dozen sheets of construction paper. Maya Bennett, his therapist, had advised me to simply preserve his drawings without demanding explanations. I turned the pages carefully. The first few depicted our old house, drawn with jagged, aggressive lines. The next page showed a tall man standing next to a computer screen, thick black wires stretching across the ceiling like spider webs. The final page stopped the breath in my throat. Noah had drawn a stick figure in a green uniform locked inside a metal cage. Above the cage, written in shaky, oversized letters, were 5 words: Mom go jail if talk. My son had not been traumatized into silence by fear of me. He had chosen silence to protect me. He had spent 6 months trapped inside his own mind, terrified that a single spoken word would send his mother to prison. He had been trying to warn me through his drawings for months, but Ryan had intercepted every single attempt. I closed the folder, blinking hard against the burning sensation in my eyes. Walking over to the rug, I sat down next to him and placed my hand gently on his back. He leaned his small weight against my shoulder, and we stayed like that until the kitchen timer buzzed. The silence in the townhouse was different from the silence in the old house. Here it felt like rest, but my phone vibrated on the counter, shattering the peace. A text message from Ryan illuminated the lock screen. "Give me primary custody and stop fighting for the house," the message read. "Do that, and I will personally tell your command the recordings were misunderstood. You know what those clips can do to your career." I took a screenshot and immediately forwarded it to Andrea. For weeks, my husband had painted himself as a desperate protector, a father just trying to save his son from an unstable woman. But arrogant people always overplay their hand. This was the very first time he had explicitly linked the safety of our child to the equity in our home and the survival of my military career. A second notification pinged on my screen, this one arriving via email. It was an automated alert from a financial monitoring service Andrea had instructed me to activate. The alert flagged a massive personal credit line, opened entirely under Ryan's name but serviced by our joint checking account. The forensic accountant had finally traced the hidden transaction. I opened the attached document, scanning the columns of numbers until my eyes hit the origination date. The massive debt had been finalized and activated exactly 1 week before Noah stopped speaking. This entire nightmare was never about protecting a child. It was never about a failing marriage. It was a calculated, desperate financial strategy built by a man who realized he was about to lose everything and decided to use his own son to pay the debt. The forensic accountant adjusted his silver glasses and slid a thick printed report across Andrea Lawson's mahogany desk. The heavy parchment paper felt rough under my fingertips as I pulled the document closer, staring at a series of highlighted bank transfers. For years I had trusted the man managing our household expenses, assuming the occasional tight month was just the cost of suburban living. The reality laid out in those black and white columns told a completely different story. Ryan had opened a massive personal line of credit entirely under his own name, routing the borrowed funds into a series of highly aggressive investment platforms. When the market turned against him, the debt spiraled. He owed nearly $286,000. To hide the bleeding, my husband had been quietly siphoning money from our joint checking account to pay the minimum balances. He simply relabeled the outbound digital transfers, making them look like routine utility upgrades and annual insurance premiums. My military salary had been keeping his financial collapse at bay, and the moment I filed for divorce, his entire house of cards would burn to the ground. We also recovered a spreadsheet from his digital workspace, the accountant said, tapping a specific page in the file. "He created this document exactly 1 week before your son stopped speaking." I flipped to the designated page, and the air seemed to leave the room. The spreadsheet was a meticulously calculated survival plan. Ryan had laid out a matrix of financial projections with chilling precision. One column listed our total house equity. The next column calculated expected monthly child support payments based on him gaining primary physical custody. A third section detailed my military salary, specifically factoring in the exact timeline of my upcoming promotion review. Highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the page was a single typed note: "If she loses command track, leverage improves." My husband had not simply lost his temper. He had built a financial model, placing a dollar value on ruining my career, determining that breaking my reputation was the only mathematical way to keep the house and avoid bankruptcy. I left the law office with a strange, cold clarity settling over me. The confusion and the heartbreak were completely gone, replaced by a quiet, methodical drive. Returning to the townhouse, I sat at the kitchen island and opened my laptop. Following strict legal counsel, I formally rerouted my direct deposit to a private account, ensuring I still transferred my lawful portion of the joint marital obligations while protecting the rest. I drafted a strict monthly budget for the new space, tracking every single grocery receipt and utility bill. Later that afternoon, I carried a piece of rough sandpaper out to the small concrete patio. I had found an old wooden desk at a local estate sale, and I spent 2 hours stripping away the chipped paint. The repetitive, physical labor grounded me. Noah came outside just as the sun dipped behind the neighboring rooftops, carrying a simple brass lamp we had purchased from a hardware store. We inspected every inch of the metal base together, confirming there were absolutely no hidden lenses, before he proudly placed it on the freshly sanded wood. Once my son was asleep, I sat in the quiet living room and logged into an emergency management certification course. I had postponed the professional development module for months, always prioritizing Ryan's work schedule over my own training. Now, the glow of the screen illuminated the dark room as I clicked through the final exam. I was no longer waiting for a military review board to validate my worth, and I was certainly not waiting for a husband to grant me permission to build a secure life. The fragile evening peace shattered when my laptop chimed with an incoming video call. The screen displayed an invitation from Scott, Ryan's younger brother. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before clicking accept. The camera feed flickered to life, showing Scott sitting next to Judith in a dimly lit dining room. My mother-in-law wore a dark sweater, her face pulled into a mask of deep, practiced suffering. "We need to talk about the reality of this situation," Scott started, leaning closer to his webcam. "Ryan is facing serious allegations, Morgan. If you push this to trial, you are going to make Noah the kid with a disgraced father. Every family at that school will know our business." Judith dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue. "You can still fix this. Just take the house settlement Ryan offered. Drop the military complaint. Keep the family reputation intact for your son's sake." They were not calling to check on Noah. They were calling to negotiate a surrender, prioritizing their social standing over the safety of an 8-year-old boy. "Did either of you ask Ryan to stop whispering threats to his son?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Scott blinked, clearly thrown off by the direct question. "Morgan, be reasonable. People make mistakes under stress." "I will take that as a no," I said, and reached for the mouse. I ended the call without another word, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. The pressure tactics that used to twist my stomach in knots simply bounced off me now. Picking up my phone, I opened the unanswered text message Ryan had sent days ago, the one demanding primary custody in exchange for clearing my name with the military. Andrea had explicitly told me how to handle it. I typed out the exact, neutral sentence my lawyer had provided. "Please send any custody proposal through counsel." I pressed send and placed the phone face down on the counter. Less than 5 minutes later, the device vibrated violently. Ryan had not texted back. He had sent an audio voice message, unable to handle the sudden clinical boundary. I tapped play, and his agitated voice filled my kitchen. "You think a lawyer is going to save you?" Ryan sneered, his breath catching the microphone on his phone. "Nobody is going to believe a woman under military investigation over a father who actually stayed home. You have no idea how much data I have. You think you saw everything down there? You have no idea what else is on those drives." A cold smile touched my lips. My husband had just formally admitted ownership and control of the hidden surveillance files, completely destroying his own narrative that the equipment was just a passive home security system. I immediately saved the audio file and forwarded it to my legal team. The next morning, the court system moved with devastating precision. Based on the financial spreadsheet and the coercive text messages, the judge signed a supplemental preservation order. This new mandate extended far beyond the physical basement rack we had already sealed. It legally locked down all cloud backups, remote synchronized accounts, and project caches tied to Ryan's devices. By noon, a process server handed the new legal documents directly to Ryan's attorney. I sat in a secure conference room with Andrea and the forensic technician, watching a live audit monitor, tracking the cloud storage tokens associated with the basement router. For 20 minutes, the screen displayed nothing but idle green text. Then, the data stream spiked. A red alert flashed across the technician's monitor, indicating an abnormal remote login from an external IP address. "He is in," the technician muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard to lock the audit log in place. The preservation order just hit him, and he is panicking. On the shared display, a directory of folders appeared. We watched in real time as a remote wipe command was executed. The digital folder labeled Angry Mom vanished from the user interface. A second later, the folder marked Custody blinked out of existence. Ryan thought he was destroying the evidence that would send him to prison. He did not realize the court-mandated monitoring software was currently logging his exact location, his device identifier, and the precise timestamp of his attempt to permanently delete federal evidence directly after being served. The red alert on the technician's monitor blinked steadily, casting a harsh crimson glow across the cramped conference room. We had caught my husband executing a remote wipe command directly after being served with the preservation order, but the victory felt hollow when the damage assessment finally rolled in an hour later. Sitting beside Andrea Lawson, I watched the forensic specialist pull up the remaining directory. A significant portion of the local audio files had vanished. The cloud backup still held the metadata and thumbnail images, proving the digital folders had existed, but the actual voice recordings inside them were corrupted or gone entirely. Ryan immediately claimed through his legal counsel that the system had simply experienced an automated synchronization error. The man blamed a network glitch, denying any manual intervention with practiced ease. Frustration burned in my chest, hot and sharp. We held the access logs, the device identifiers, and the specific account tokens proving a manual command had been issued. However, arguing technical infrastructure in a family court could easily become a muddy, drawn-out battle. I needed undeniable, cross-referenced proof that did not rely on a single vulnerable cloud server. The technician leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen against his chin while staring at the corrupted files. He asked if Ryan used any specific software to trim the audio before sending it out. I remembered the perfectly sliced 40-second clip that had derailed my military career. The specialist immediately pivoted, pulling up the forensic image of a dusty work laptop. Ryan had retired a year ago but kept wired into the basement network for extra processing power. Professional editing software automatically generates hidden project cache files, saving temporary versions of a timeline to prevent data loss during a computer crash. My husband had meticulously wiped the exported audio from the cloud, but the amateur sound engineer had completely forgotten to empty the hidden system cache on his old hardware. Opening the cache directory revealed a digital goldmine. The project files displayed exact editing timelines, showing the precise timestamps where Ryan had sliced the original 6-minute recording down to 40 seconds. Multiple export versions sat in the hidden folder, each one labeled with different lengths, proving a deliberate, calculated manipulation of the evidence. While digging through the laptop's registry to verify the timestamps, the technician stumbled across something even more damning than the audio edits. Browser artifacts buried deep in the hard drive contained a fragment of a very familiar document. It was a draft of the anonymous complaint sent to my military command weeks earlier. Reading the text file on the monitor, my pulse thrummed heavily against my throat. The very first iteration of the letter started with the phrase, "As the father of Noah I have observed." A digital strike line crossed out those words in the revision history, replaced in the second draft by the phrase, "As a concerned parent at the school." The recovery email address linked to the fake account pointed directly to Ryan's personal inbox. The man who publicly claimed he was desperately trying to protect our son had impersonated a fictional parent to destroy my reputation. That single drafted document provided the exact leverage Andrea needed to bring Judith into the light. The following Tuesday, my mother-in-law sat across a long oak table in a stark deposition room, flanked by her own nervous attorney. She wore a tailored navy blazer, her chin lifted in a mask of offended dignity. Under oath, the older woman formally claimed she had written her sworn affidavit entirely by herself, denying any coordination with her son. Andrea did not raise her voice, nor did she accuse the woman of lying. The lawyer simply slid a printed page across the polished wood. It was the metadata footprint of Judith's digital affidavit, proving the document had been created on Ryan's laptop. A second sheet of paper followed, displaying an email thread between the two of them. Ryan had sent his mother a rigid list of bullet points detailing my supposed anger issues, and she had merely polished the grammar before signing her name to the legal document. "Did you ever actually see my client's son cringing in her presence?" Andrea asked, her tone clinical and flat. Judith stared at the printed emails resting on the table. Her rigid posture completely collapsed, her shoulders slumping forward as the reality of the perjury trap closed around her. She looked away from me, focusing her gaze on the blank white wall behind Andrea's chair. "I trusted my son," Judith whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the room. "He told me she was hurting the boy." "You swore to what you trusted," Andrea replied, smoothly packing the papers back into her leather briefcase. "Not what you saw." My mother-in-law had finally faced a consequence for her blind enabling, but the legal victory did not repair the tangible damage already done to my life. That afternoon, my phone rang with a scheduled call from Colonel Harper. The command had finished reviewing the timeline of the civilian investigation. Because the family court process and the forensic audits were extending past the current quarter, the military could not complete my administrative review in time for the seasonal promotion board. "The board cannot move forward with unresolved domestic allegations attached to your file," the colonel explained, her tone apologetic but firm. My name was officially pulled from the roster. I had spent a decade building that career, sacrificing weekends and holidays to prove my dedication to the unit. Losing the opportunity did not break me, but it left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I drove back to the townhouse with the windows rolled down, letting the warm wind pull the tension from my neck. Walking into the living room, I found Noah sitting on the rug, carefully tracing the outline of a maple leaf he had found on the concrete patio. I sat down next to him, leaning my back against the fabric of the sofa. Resting on the coffee table was the fresh certificate for the emergency management course I had finished the week before. Noah noticed the thick paper and set his pencil down. He picked up his yellow sticky pad, wrote a few letters with careful precision, and handed the note to me. "Your uniform okay?" My chest ached, a deep, hollow pressure settling under my ribs. I pulled a pen from my pocket and wrote a reply on the exact same small square of paper. "My uniform is mine. Your voice is yours." I passed the note back across the rug. Noah read the words slowly, his dark eyes tracing the ink. He looked up at me, took a deep breath, and opened his mouth. A tiny, breathy sound escaped his throat, barely a whisper, not quite a full word, but a genuine, unforced vocalization. I did not push him to say more, and I did not turn the moment into a celebration. I just smiled, folded the sticky note, and tucked it into my pocket. We were rebuilding, step by slow step, but the legal war still required one final, public battle. 3 days later, the stark fluorescent lights of the family courthouse illuminated the polished wooden benches of the gallery. It was the preliminary hearing to determine temporary primary custody and address the emergency petitions Ryan had filed. My husband arrived looking like the perfect, aggrieved suburban father, He wore a crisp gray suit, his hair neatly styled, projecting a carefully cultivated aura of exhausted patience. His lawyer immediately launched into a polished narrative, pacing in front of the judge's bench. The opposing counsel painted me as a hostile spouse, desperately trying to destroy a marriage out of pure career ambition. He argued that the basement equipment was nothing more than a consensual home security system, installed only after my temper became unpredictable. He claimed Noah had stopped speaking because he was terrified of my anger, and presented Ryan as the dedicated, stay-at-home parent who had sacrificed his own professional trajectory to keep the family stable. Sitting at the defense table, I kept my hands folded in my lap and my face entirely blank. I refused to give them a single reaction while being described as a dangerous stranger in my own home. "Your Honor, we have audio evidence that requires immediate consideration," Ryan's lawyer announced, pulling a sleek tablet from his leather briefcase. "This recording demonstrates the exact toxic environment my client has been trying to protect his son from." He formally submitted the 40-second clip, the exact same file Ryan had used to trigger the military investigation. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, granted temporary permission to review the file for the limited purpose of the emergency motion. Ryan turned his head slightly, catching my eye from across the center aisle. A small, confident smile played at the corners of his mouth. He actually believed the truncated, highly emotional audio would overwhelm all the forensic logs and metadata we had quietly gathered over the last month. He thought a few seconds of my shouting would make the judge deaf to the truth. I felt a sudden spike of adrenaline, my heart hammering against my ribs, but Andrea placed a cool, steady hand on my wrist under the table. The attorney did not object to the submission. She did not argue about admissibility or demand an immediate sidebar. She just leaned toward me, her eyes fixed entirely on the arrogant man across the room. "Let him play it," Andrea whispered. The courtroom fell completely silent as the short audio clip ended. Ryan sat in the witness box, carefully adjusting the cuffs of his tailored gray suit. He looked directly at the judge, weaving a meticulous narrative of a dedicated father forced to take extreme, desperate measures. My husband testified that he only installed the basement security system after my temper became entirely unpredictable. He painted himself as the stable anchor of our household, the man who sacrificed his own professional trajectory to manage doctor appointments and school pickups while I chased military promotions. Sitting 2 rows behind him in the gallery, Judith nodded along with every single word, pressing a tissue to her collarbone. I focused my gaze on the polished wood of the defense table, refusing to give them the angry reaction they needed to complete the picture. His defense attorney paced slowly across the well of the courtroom, letting the 40-second audio snippet echo in the heavy air. The clip ended right after my shouted demand that I could not do this anymore. Ryan gripped the edge of the witness stand, lowering his head. He claimed that specific night was the moment he knew he had to protect Noah from my escalating instability. Andrea Lawson stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket, and approached the podium for cross-examination. The attorney did not carry a thick binder of notes, just a single yellow legal pad. "Mr. Hayes, you submitted this 40-second audio file to my client's military command, and to this court," Andrea stated, her voice projecting clearly across the large room. "Is this the complete recording of that evening?" Ryan shifted his weight in the wooden chair. "It is the relevant part of the interaction, the part where she lost control." "The relevant part," Andrea repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air for a long moment before turning back to our table. She formally requested permission to call our digital forensic expert to the stand. The technician walked to the front of the room, carrying a thick stack of printed metadata logs. Sworn in and seated, the expert calmly explained the fundamental difference between an exported audio snippet and a raw source file. He walked the judge through the hidden project cache recovered from Ryan's old work laptop, demonstrating exactly how the digital timeline had been manually sliced to remove specific voices and alter the context. Andrea entered the full 6-minute recording into evidence and asked the clerk to play the file. Static hissed through the courtroom speakers, followed by the heavy sound of a door opening. Then came the unmistakable noise of Ryan waking our 8-year-old son near midnight. My voice entered the room next, desperate and hushed, asking my husband to step out into the hallway. The audio captured Ryan deliberately blocking the door, pushing his verbal provocations until my exhaustion finally shattered into a shout. The recording did not stop there. The silence stretched out as my footsteps faded down the hall. "That one was better," Ryan whispered through the speakers. The opposing counsel jumped to his feet, objecting loudly that the file had been manipulated or altered by my legal team. The judge raised her hand, silencing the lawyer instantly, and looked directly at the forensic expert. The technician simply pointed to the metadata logs displayed on the evidence monitor. The digital footprint proved beyond any technical doubt that Ryan's 40-second submission was the manipulated export, while our 6-minute file was the untouched original. Ryan swallowed hard, his practiced composure beginning to crack at the edges. He tried to pivot, arguing that even if the context was broader, my anger that night was still real and dangerous to our child. Andrea did not argue the point. Instead, she pulled a single sheet of paper from her legal pad and projected it onto the monitor. It was an entry from the incident journal I had kept hidden for months, written at 6 a.m. immediately following that exact argument. "My client documented your habit of waking your son to initiate conflicts long before she ever filed for divorce," Andrea explained, pulling up a second document. "In fact, she sent you an email that very afternoon begging you to stop using Noah's sleep schedule as a battlefield." The email exchange appeared on the screen. My message was brief and pleading. Ryan's written reply sat right below it, timestamped 10 hours after the audio recording. "Then stop coming home like a commander," his text read. The narrative of the terrified, victimized father crumbled under the weight of his own written arrogance. He had not recorded a spontaneous crisis. My husband had engineered a conflict, graded the performance, and then mocked me for trying to stop it. Leaning forward in the witness chair, Ryan gripped the microphone. He insisted he only wanted Noah to be safe, repeating the phrase like a protective mantra. He claimed every action he took, every file he saved, was driven by a desperate need to secure primary custody for the well-being of our child. "You were very concerned about custody," Andrea agreed, tapping her pen against the podium. "Let us look at a text message you sent my client just a few days ago." A screenshot of Ryan's coercive demand filled the large evidence monitor. The text explicitly offered to explain the recordings to my military command and drop the public allegations, but only if I surrendered primary custody and stopped fighting for my share of the house equity. Andrea stepped closer to the witness box. "Mr. Hayes, if you genuinely believed my client was a physical and emotional danger to your son, why were you willing to trade his safety for the deed to a suburban house?" Ryan opened his mouth, closed it, and looked frantically toward his own attorney. He stammered something about attempting to negotiate a peaceful settlement, but the words sounded hollow and panicked in the quiet courtroom. The financial motive laid bare in that single text message exposed the entire surveillance operation for what it truly was. It was a calculated economic strategy completely devoid of any parental concern. "I just wanted to keep my boy safe," Ryan repeated. The defiance was completely gone from his voice, leaving only a reedy, desperate tone. Andrea looked at him with absolute, freezing calm. "Then, let us hear exactly how you kept him safe." "Your Honor, I request permission to play the final, unedited portion of the recovered audio file." The color drained instantly from Ryan's face. His eyes widened, darting from the judge to his lawyer, and the polished mask of the perfect suburban father finally shattered. His attorney immediately stood up, loudly requesting an emergency recess to confer with his client. The man knew something devastating was about to drop, and he desperately needed to stop the legal momentum. Overruled, the judge stated, her voice cutting through the rising tension in the room like a steel blade. Play the file, counselor. Andrea nodded to the clerk. The audio resumed, filling the silent courtroom with the small, jagged sounds of Noah crying. The terrible, muffled hiccups of a terrified 8-year-old boy echoed off the wooden walls. Then, Ryan's voice cut through the weeping, devoid of any warmth or paternal comfort. When they ask who scares you, who do you point to? The recorded voice demanded. Noah did not answer on the tape. He just continued to cry. Ryan leaned forward in the witness box, his hands trembling violently against the wooden rail. He stared at the speakers as if they were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. If you tell them about the microphones, the voice from the speakers hissed, filling the courtroom with the sound of a father destroying his own son. The terrible sound of a father destroying his own son poured from the courtroom speakers, raw and unfiltered. The recording captured the heavy silence following Ryan's threat about my military uniform, capturing the exact moment an 8-year-old boy realized he held his mother's freedom in his hands. Silence is fine, Ryan's recorded voice murmured into the quiet playroom. Silence tells them enough. The digital track finally hissed to a halt, leaving the massive courtroom so quiet I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. My hands rested flat against the polished oak of the defense table, and the smooth wood felt freezing cold under my palms. The pieces slammed together in my mind with physical force. The quiet dinners, the refusal to speak at school, the terrified glances at the ceiling corners. The man sitting in the witness box had not merely documented our son's trauma. He had actively manufactured it, carefully shaping a child's protective silence into a functional piece of legal leverage. I turned my head slightly, looking at the blue plastic folder resting beside Andrea Lawson's legal pad. The drawings inside that folder were not cries for help. They were apologies from a boy who thought he was responsible for keeping me out of a cage. Andrea did not ask Ryan another question about the audio. The attorney simply let his recorded threat hang in the stagnant air before formally requesting to call our next witness. The judge nodded, her expression carved from stone, and instructed Ryan to step down. Dr. Maya Bennett walked down the center aisle with calm, measured steps. The independent child therapist took the oath and seated herself in the wooden box, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. Andrea approached the podium, asking the clinician to explain exactly how my son communicated during his private sessions. Noah communicates quite effectively when he feels completely secure, Maya stated, her voice projecting warmth and absolute professional certainty. He uses written words, illustrations, and choice cards. He simply refuses to speak aloud in environments he cannot control. The therapist firmly declined to offer a legal diagnosis, sticking entirely to her clinical observations. She confirmed to the court that my husband had repeatedly insisted on being physically present during early therapy sessions, constantly attempting to guide the narrative. Furthermore, Maya explicitly clarified that Noah's refusal to speak did not automatically indicate a fear of his mother, completely dismantling the core premise of the emergency petition. The judge took rapid notes, securing the fact that my child would never need to enter this building or face a hostile interrogation to prove his own reality. With the custody angle severely weakened, Andrea pivoted her attack toward the paper trail, recalling Ryan to the stand. The attorney projected a digital document onto the large evidence monitor, displaying a recovered draft of the anonymous complaint that had derailed my military promotion. The original text began with the phrase, "As the father of Noah," and a bright red digital strike line crossed those words out. The revised sentence read, "As a concerned parent at the school." The forensic log confirms this draft was saved on your local device, and the recovery email for the anonymous account points directly to your personal inbox, Andrea noted, tapping her pen against the wooden podium. The language in this complaint also matches the exact phrasing in your mother's sworn affidavit. Why would a parent, acting out of genuine concern, Need to impersonate a stranger. Ryan gripped the edges of the witness box, a thin layer of sweat shining on his forehead. He stammered, claiming he used a fake account because he feared military retaliation, but the desperate explanation crumbled before it even reached the judge. The man had orchestrated a coordinated character assassination, using identical talking points across multiple platforms to create the illusion of independent witnesses. The illusion completely shattered when Andrea brought up the financial spreadsheet. The grid of numbers filled the monitor, exposing a cold, calculated strategy completely devoid of parental love. Andrea walked the court through the creation date, proving the financial model was saved exactly 1 week before the anonymous complaint was ever drafted. She highlighted the specific columns calculating house equity, predicted child support payments, and the financial impact of my delayed military promotion. You created a financial projection mapping out the exact monetary value of ruining my client's career, Andrea said, zooming in on the small yellow comment box at the bottom of the screen. Pressure before board. This was never a rescue mission, Mr. Hayes. This was a hostile corporate takeover of a family. Ryan opened his mouth, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He claimed the spreadsheet was simply responsible divorce planning, an attempt to understand his financial liabilities. The judge leaned forward over her heavy wooden bench, her eyes narrowing as she looked from the spreadsheet back to the sweating man. Planning for a divorce was standard practice, but timing a false military complaint to maximize financial leverage crossed a very dangerous legal line. Before the opposing counsel could attempt a frantic redirection, Andrea delivered the final procedural blow. She summoned the digital forensic expert's audit log to the screen, displaying the precise timeline of the supplemental cloud preservation order. The document proved the mandate was legally served to Ryan's attorney at noon. Exactly 14 minutes later, an external IP address linked to Ryan's current location initiated a remote wipe command. My client's automated synchronization software frequently experiences glitches, the opposing defense lawyer interjected, standing up in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The audit log explicitly shows a manual selection of 2 specific directories, Andrea countered, her voice ringing with absolute finality. The user manually selected the folders labeled Angry Mom and Custody and actively confirmed the deletion prompt. This was the intentional destruction of federal evidence. The judge raised her hand, silencing the defense table immediately. She stated for the official record that the court would apply a severe adverse inference regarding the deleted files, assuming the destroyed data would have been entirely detrimental to Ryan's case. Furthermore, the magistrate formally noted that local investigators would be notified regarding the unauthorized access and the deliberate destruction of preserved evidence. The courtroom felt incredibly small as Ryan stepped down from the box, his crisp gray suit now looking rumpled and ill-fitting. The final casualty of his collapsing narrative was his own mother. Judith took the stand shortly after, clutching her expensive leather purse like a shield. Under Andrea's relentless, quiet questioning, the older woman was forced to look at the metadata proving her son had essentially written her sworn statement. "Did you ever witness the abuse you swore to in this document?" Andrea asked. Judith's lower lip trembled, and she looked toward the defense table, but Ryan would not meet her eyes. She gripped the microphone, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper. She admitted she had never seen Noah cringing in my presence. "I believe my son," Judith cried, a single tear slipping down her powdered cheek. The judge did not offer an ounce of sympathy. The magistrate sternly reminded the witness that blind belief did not replace factual observation on a sworn legal document. The court immediately struck the affidavit from the record and severely restricted Judith's access, mandating that she would have absolutely no unsupervised contact with her grandson for the foreseeable future. I kept my eyes fixed on the blank monitor, refusing to give the crying woman the validation of my attention. The ruling came down less than an hour later, swift and devoid of any lingering ambiguity. The judge completely dismissed the emergency petition filed by my husband. Based on the overwhelming evidence of coercive control, emotional abuse, and the manipulation of a minor, the court granted me full primary physical custody and sole temporary decision-making authority. Ryan was stripped of all unsupervised access. He would be allowed limited, professionally supervised visitation only after completing a rigorous psychological evaluation. All future communication between us was strictly restricted to a monitored co-parenting application. The division of the house and the remaining financial assets would be handled in the final divorce decree, but the immediate safety of my son was legally secured. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and I stepped out into the brightly lit hallway beside Andrea. The air felt lighter out here, completely separate from the suffocating pressure of the last 6 weeks. A few moments later, Ryan emerged from the double doors, followed closely by his defeated attorney. 2 men wearing plain gray suits and carrying thick leather folders stepped out from the alcove near the elevators. They moved with a quiet, authoritative purpose, blocking the path to the exit. They were civilian investigators, and they possessed the paperwork to initiate a formal inquiry into the digital impersonation, the unauthorized system access, and the felony destruction of court-preserved evidence. Ryan stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the 2 investigators, then turned his head slowly to look at me. The polished mask was entirely gone, leaving only a hollow, frantic man. "You destroyed our family," Ryan said, his voice dripping with venom. I stopped walking. I did not raise my voice, nor did I step toward him. I simply looked at the man who had turned our home into a weapon. "You built a room to prove I was the danger," I replied, my tone perfectly even. "Then you recorded yourself." The 2 investigators stepped forward, quietly instructing my husband to accompany them to a separate room for processing. Andrea placed a hand on my shoulder, gently guiding me toward the elevators at the opposite end of the long corridor. The attorney pressed the call button, watching the metal doors slide open, and quietly reminded me that while the family court battle had been won, the criminal consequences for the man I married were only just beginning. The smell of roasted coffee beans and sharp pine cleaner fills the small kitchen of our townhouse. 13 months have passed since the night my son called me from a hidden emergency phone, terrified of the man walking through the front door. The space finally feels lived in, anchored by the slightly uneven wooden desk I sanded down by hand and the small potted fern resting on the windowsill. Noah speaks now. The vocabulary flows quietly when we sit together on the rug, and he talks comfortably with Dr. Bennett during their sessions, though he still retreats into absolute silence in crowded grocery stores or loud public parks. I do not count the words anymore, nor do I treat his recovery as a metric to be measured on a chart. Sitting at his newly repaired desk, the boy opens the familiar blue plastic folder. The pages inside feature bright crayon drawings of our current living room, and the ceilings in his pictures are completely bare, free of any small red dots or hidden wires. The final divorce decree arrived by certified mail during the 2nd week of October, bringing a thick stack of heavily notarized documents that officially ended a decade of marriage. Selling the marital residence resolved the heavy mortgage and the lingering legal liens that threatened to drown us. My name was formally severed from the massive personal credit line the former information systems manager had secretly opened, allocating that specific financial disaster entirely to the man who created it. The family court magistrate also ordered him to cover the exorbitant forensic accounting fees, citing his deliberate attempts to conceal data and wipe the cloud servers after being served with the preservation order. I retained my full military retirement benefits and the separate savings account I had quietly built before the crisis began. Andrea Lawson called to review the final settlement, sounding almost surprised over the phone that I had not fought harder to retain the physical property. "I did not want the house," I told the attorney, watching the autumn leaves drift across my small concrete patio. "I wanted my name off the debt and my son out of the room he built." The local prosecutors did not let the digital manipulation slide, refusing to offer a quiet dismissal for a first-time offender. Facing a mountain of immutable metadata and pristine audit logs, the man who used to control every aspect of our lives eventually accepted a criminal plea agreement. The presiding judge handed down a sentence that included actual time in a county facility, followed by a strict period of supervised probation. The court legally barred him from operating any network surveillance equipment and mandated that all future communication pass exclusively through a monitored co-parenting portal. The felony conviction immediately cost him his lucrative civilian defense contract, stripping away the professional identity he valued so highly. During the final sentencing hearing, Ryan stood before the bench in a wrinkled suit and still claimed I had stolen his family. The criminal magistrate simply adjusted her glasses, leaning over the heavy wooden desk, and stated that a father who weaponizes his child's terror belongs in a cell. The state-mandated supervised visitation took place a week later in a neutral, sterile room, smelling strongly of industrial bleach and stale carpet. A licensed social worker sat in the corner holding a clipboard, observing the interaction silently. Ryan looked exhausted, his posture slumped, and his eyes shadowed, appearing much older than 41. Noah sat next to me at the small plastic table, keeping his hands neatly folded in his lap. He had the absolute right to choose exactly how he communicated during these required hours, and he had chosen not to bring his voice into this building. "Dad did everything because he loved you," Ryan started, leaning forward with a desperate, practiced look of sorrow. The supervisor immediately cleared her throat, firmly instructing the visitor to refrain from assigning blame or justifying the documented abuse. Noah did not look up. The 8-year-old boy simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small square of yellow paper, and slid it across the smooth table. Ryan looked down at the handwritten note. "You told me silence would save Mom," the text read. For the first time in his life, my ex-husband could not open a software program and cut out the part of the story that made him look like a monster. He stared at the terrible truth written in childish block letters, and his jaw worked silently. Noah quietly pulled the paper back across the table, returning it to his pocket without a single change in expression. Judith attempted her own form of reconciliation a few weeks later. The meeting occurred at a crowded local coffee shop, far away from the sanctuary of our townhouse. My former mother-in-law stirred a porcelain cup with a silver spoon, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She asked for forgiveness, claiming she had been completely manipulated by the lies her son fed her. "I believed my son," the older woman whispered, dabbing her cheek with a pristine white napkin. The excuse sounded entirely hollow over the hiss of the espresso machine and the chatter of the morning crowd. She wanted absolution without acknowledging her own active participation in the smear campaign. "You chose the version that asked nothing of you," I replied, keeping my hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. Judith begged for an afternoon alone with Noah, promising to take him to the park and buy him ice cream. I shook my head, standing up from the small metal chair and pushing it in. Trust required genuine accountability, and any future relationship would be built exclusively on my son's terms, not her sudden need for a clear conscience. The military administrative review concluded shortly after the criminal plea entered the public record. Colonel Harper summoned me back to the exact same windowless briefing room where the nightmare had originally begun. The commander formally cleared my file of all wrongdoing, placing the investigative report into the permanent archives. She did not offer me the delayed promotion as an apology, and I did not ask for a sympathy rank to validate my suffering. Instead, I accepted a slightly different, highly stable position within the Continuity Operations Division. The new role offered solid professional growth without requiring constant weekend deployments, allowing me to build a reliable childcare network. That same evening, I finalized my civilian emergency management certification. Completing the difficult online course proved I possessed valuable options outside the uniform, ending the underlying fear that I was trapped in one specific career path. I no longer needed to choose between being a dedicated soldier and a protective mother just to satisfy the impossible standards of an insecure man. The air inside the townhouse felt warm and entirely still as November settled over the neighborhood. I stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, listening to the quiet sounds of a perfectly normal evening. Noah sat on the living room rug, organizing his colored pencils by shade and laying them out in a neat row. He paused his work, looking up at the painted ceiling, before turning his dark eyes toward me. "Are we going home?" the boy asked, his voice soft but completely clear over the sound of a simmering pot. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, stepping around the island to look at the space we had built together over the last 13 months. "We already did," I told him, smiling down at his messy pile of art supplies. Noah opened the blue plastic folder, pulling out a fresh drawing, and handed the thick paper to me. The crayon image depicted the two of us standing in front of a small townhouse with a bright red door, and the sky above the roof was completely empty of watching eyes. My phone buzzed against the granite counter, vibrating with an automated notification. It was a legal alert confirming the former project manager had officially been transferred to the county facility to begin his sentence. I picked up the device, looked at the glowing screen for a brief second, and placed it face down next to the cutting board. He did not get to interrupt our dinner anymore. Ryan had spent 6 months teaching my son that silence was the only way to keep me safe. In the end, the truth did what silence never could. It gave us a home. Sometimes, the most dangerous threats in your life do not arrive with a raised voice or a shattered glass. They come disguised as deep concern, wrapped in the quiet manipulation of someone who claims they are only trying to protect your family. When you find yourself walking on eggshells in your own house, constantly terrified that your natural reactions will be recorded and weaponized against you, you are no longer in a partnership. You are in a cage. The reality of coercive control is that it relies entirely on isolating you and making you doubt your own sanity. A deeply toxic partner will use whatever leverage they can find, even weaponizing the fear and silence of your own children just to maintain their absolute grip on your life and your assets. You must understand that staying quiet to keep the peace never actually buys you peace. It only funds their continued power over you. True strength does not require you to scream louder than your abuser or tear down their reputation in a desperate public spectacle. Real power is methodical and patient. It is quietly securing your finances, documenting the absolute truth, building an independent support system, and letting the manipulator's own suffocating arrogance become their ultimate undoing. You do not have to prove your worth or your sanity to someone who is entirely committed to misunderstanding you for their own gain. You simply have to gather your evidence, set unbreakable boundaries, and find the courage to walk away. A home is never defined by the name on a heavy mortgage or the outward perfection of a suburban family portrait. A real home is a place where you and your children can breathe without fear, where your voices belong entirely to you, and where the walls do not listen. Leaving a situation like that requires a terrifying leap into the unknown, but the quiet freedom waiting on the other side is always worth the heavy cost of rebuilding. If you recognize the dark echoes of this manipulation in your own life, please know that you are not crazy, and you are certainly not alone. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who constantly twisted the truth to make themselves the victim? And how did you finally find the strength to reclaim your own voice? Share your experience in the comments below, because your survival story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear to finally unlock her own front door.